Republican Party's voter suppression war machine grinds on, and once again, it is targeting student voting. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Marc, Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
You know, Paige, fads come and go. You know, the Republican Party can decide they hate vote by mail. They can decide they hate in-person early voting. They can decide they want to, crank up lies about non-citizen voting. But the one constant theme through all of it is that they are always targeting student voting.
They hate student voters, and I will hand it to Republicans. Every legislative session, they seem to find some new way to target and suppress student voters, especially college students.
Yeah, and so, I saw recently a couple of articles, one suggesting that they are targeting student voters in Indiana, another that they are targeting student voters in Montana. And literally the first thing that went through my mind is like, do they never stop? Here we are. Donald Trump is doing all of the terrible things he is doing at the federal level. And I've warned, and I've written in Democracy Docket, that we are going to see the same tactics that Donald Trump and his cronies are using to try to crush the opposition in the federal government. We're going to see that pivot towards elections because, after all, the original theory or the original uncompromised principle of Donald Trump's movement is election denialism. And voter suppression goes hand in hand with that. So, we've been warning about that and we've been waiting to see it. But now, Paige, like I said, I saw these articles, one in Montana, one in Indiana, that this is in fact the path they are on.
Right. In Indiana, state Republicans are pushing a bill to repeal the use of student ID cards as an accepted form for voting. Now, Indiana has had this law in place for, I want to say, almost 20 years. They have had it for a while and it's worked, right? And even more so, it's a really strict rule to use your student ID card. It has to come from a public institution in the state. Private universities in Indiana, those ID cards won't work. But now, 20 years later, state Republicans are deciding that it's too easy for students to vote. Falsely, they're claiming that student ID cards are a source of voter fraud. As we all know, there is absolutely no evidence of widespread voter fraud anywhere in the country. And then over in Montana, Republicans there are pushing a bill to redefine residency requirements to say that if you're living in Montana for educational purposes, that does not mean that you are a resident who is qualified to vote.
Right. And so, we can take these in order, but both of these have, pretty strong historical echoes or lineages. Many people don't realize, but the first state to popularize the current ID craze, this current craze that Republicans have been on involving voter ID, was the state of Indiana, right? And it was the law that you are referring to. And that is a case that wound up going to the U.S. Supreme Court, Crawford versus Marion County, in which the Supreme Court blessed voter ID laws under many circumstances. And you're exactly right, Paige. That was a strict voter ID law at the time. We were all assured, and we have been assured by Republican state after Republican state after Republican state, that, you cannot trust the private university IDs, but that the public university IDs are state-issued identification, right? So the same state that is issuing a driver's license, the same state that is issuing a concealed carry permit in some states, or, whatever other IDs that states issue, they are also the ones issuing these state-issued student IDs, right? So there's no reason to believe that a public university ID in Indiana is any more or less secure than their driver's license or than any other ID that the state issues, because they are in fact state issued. But, so this is entirely pretextual. I would argue the entire photo ID thing is pretextual. The not allowing private university IDs is pretextual. But it is certainly at the point that you are now saying, well, this state issued document is safe enough, but that state issued document is not. It's really hard, for Republicans to say with a straight face, this is anything other than trying to fence out of the political process a group of voters who they simply don't want to participate, which are students.
Right. And I think, again, with the argument of voter ID, it's completely separate from voter registration, right? The complaint we hear from Republicans again and again is that student ID cards aren't proof of citizenship, aren't proof of voter eligibility. And it's like, yes, that's not what the point of a voter ID card is. It's to match the face with the name of the person in front of you trying to cast the ballot. All of these students have already registered to vote. They have attested that they are US citizens. They have fulfilled all the requirements Indiana sets out to become registered voters. This is just a problem of them showing up to vote at the polls. And oh, by the way, Indiana Republicans have also tried to take away polling places on campus. Purdue in 2024, for the first time in 20 years, didn't have a polling site on campus.
Not a day goes by that the Trump administration does not open a new front in their assault on our democracy. Look, they're firing key federal watchdogs, they're freezing critical funding, they're trying to massively expand the power of the presidency. Now, to make sense of all this chaos, Democracy Docket has launched its new Trump Accountability Tracker, which is your source for a bird's eye view on these developments as they happen. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. So click on the link above or in the description below to become a premium Democracy Docket member to receive access to our exclusive Trump Accountability Tracker today. You know, it's a really important point you make about what it is the ID is proving. Because, you know, and I'm going to say something here that is probably even a little more provocative or controversial. It has never been clear to me why a Texas driver's license is good enough to prove who someone is if they vote in Texas, but not good enough to prove who they are if they vote in Ohio, and vice versa, right? Like, I don't even understand the theory of why it has to be state-issued ID from your own state, because there's no reason to believe that Texas is handing out false driver's licenses. And as you point out, the purpose of the ID is not to prove residency. Right? It's not to prove that they're eligible to vote in the state. It's literally to prove that they are the person they say they are. And so every time you see this curtailment of what ID is acceptable, understand that, everyone. What is being curtailed is not something that is proving eligibility to vote. It is, what's being curtailed is something that proves identity. And so to say that somehow, you know, a state issued ID in Indiana is somehow more or less likely to prove that the person standing in front of them is the person they say they are than something else is really a fallacy. And, you know, Paige, it also reminds me of, you know, one of the things we heard out of North Carolina when they were focused on digital IDs. And they're like, but, you know, they can fake them. And you're left being like, wait a second. So let me get this straight. You're saying you think that college students, you don't think they're faking driver's licenses, right? You don't think they're doing that, right? You don't think that you think that they're not doing because, you know, but what they're really, because, for example, they wouldn't want to get into a bar, you know, with a fake driver's license. What they're really doing, what you really think is going on here is that they're going to go to the trouble of faking a college ID for the purpose of voting. And like, it defies the logic or the common sense or the lived experience of anyone who's being honest.
Marc, and again about your point about voter ID not necessarily proving residency, just matching a face with a name, passports are an accepted form of voter ID in many states. And that doesn't say where that person is currently living, only where you were born. And speaking of very malicious ways to kind of purposely exclude college students, this proposed legislation in Montana specifically carves out people who are living in Montana for educational purposes, i.e. attending college or university, from using that address to register to vote.
Yeah, and you know, I mentioned that there are historical echoes and through lines here, and we talked about that with Indiana. This also has a historical echo and through line. You know, I've written about this on Democracy Docket. Democracy Docket has covered these issues that we're seeing in both of these states before. So I want to take a second to make sure that if you are not already signed up for Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters, go ahead and do that now. The link is above and in the notes of the show below. You can also become a premium member, and there are links to those as well. But, you know, Paige, it was the state of Texas that in the 1950s and early 1960s was concerned that people who did not have permanent connections with Texas might be voting in Texas elections. Now, at that time, the people they were trying to keep out of the process were members of the military, right? They were worried that you were going to have all of these young people who had no connections or no lasting ties to Texas. They were going to be stationed in Texas, and they were therefore going to become Texas voters. And that was a big concern to the existing powers that be in Texas, and they didn't like it. So they tried to pass laws to keep out people who were simply in Texas because they were stationed in Texas, right? These were targeting members of the military. Now, it's interesting that here we are now in Montana, and they are not targeting members of the military. They're targeting people who are students, but it just goes to show you that this pattern of targeting young voters because you think this group of young voters is not going to be with us, and that over time it shifts as to kind of who they are, has been a recurring theme in American politics. And of course, the Constitution was actually amended in the early 1970s to extend the right to vote to people who are 18 or older. They couldn't be discriminated against based on their age. And yet here we are, Paige, we continue to see these fights continue, even after that amendment, even after it was ratified by the states, various ways trying to do this. Democracy Docket has reported on a lawsuit that had been brought as a result of laws in New Hampshire that also tried to make this. In Texas, tried it, right? So we see these echoes over the years, and people need to understand those through lines because no one state is like coming up with something entirely novel. They are importing the same tactics over the course of generations, over the course of years. And of course, Montana has been a frequent flyer in recent years of trying to figure out how to target students, and they have failed. We saw a series of laws that Montana has passed to try to make voting harder generally, some of them targeting students specifically, and those have been struck down. And and by the way, the state of Texas's laws back then were also struck down. So I don't think this law is going to survive if it is enacted in its current form. I suspect it'll be challenged in court. I suspect it'll lose. But Paige, this also ties with something very recent, which is Montana's effort to sort of rid itself of judicial review of some of these things.
Right, Marc, we recently talked about how the U.S. Supreme Court rejected a petition out of Montana that was trying to use the discredited independent state legislature theory to overturn a decision from the Montana Supreme Court that struck down voter suppression laws for violating the state constitution. And one of those laws that was struck down was a law that removed the use of student ID cards as a form of voter ID in Montana.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that rather than say, okay, we passed these laws and they were bad laws, and our own state Supreme Court, not some federal judge far away, our own state Supreme Court said it violated the Montana Constitution, right? Like it violated, like you're in Montana and it's like your court is saying it violates Montana Constitution, rather than that being a guidepost of like, okay, we should probably not be doing those things. Their reaction was to actually go to the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., not a Montana court, and say, please, limit the ability of our own courts to apply our own constitutions. And, I don't know about you, Paige, but there's something really perverse about that.
Right, Marc, it's outrageous and abhorrent. It was important enough to Montana to enshrine these voter protections in its state constitution. But when it was used to protect the rights of student voters, state officials said, no, this shouldn't be happening. This isn't what we want. And then tried to get the U.S. Supreme Court to strike it down using a radical theory that they've already rejected once before that has the potential to completely upend the judicial system in the United States.
Paige, I have to ask you a question. I litigate a lot of these cases. I've brought a lot of cases to protect student voting, but I know it's something you actually, as a personal matter, have passion around and have followed yourself, both as someone who works Democracy Docket, but just sort of in your general area of interest. Why do you think it is that Republicans feel so comfortable like culturally comfortable targeting students directly, right? I mean, like they wouldn't pass a law that was explicitly racist. They'll pass laws that are racist, like don't get me wrong, but they wouldn't be like, you know what, we're going to pass a law and we are going to like issue a press release saying we are targeting black voters. Again, they do target black voters, but that's not, they don't campaign on that as an issue. Why do you think there is this like cultural acceptance in the Republican Party to be openly hostile to young voters?
Marc, I'm going to challenge you and say it's not just the Republican Party. It's not just the Democratic Party. It is quote unquote, older people, real adults, if you'll use that term with quotation marks, who see student voters who are normally college students, 18 to 22-year-olds. They kind of brush off college students in a lot of different ways, right? How many times have you thought college students could be immature? They don't have that real world experience. They don't know what's really going on. We don't need to hold their opinions as worthy and value as someone maybe 20 or 30 years their senior. So they're easy to brush off because they don't actually think that they're that important. Yeah, it would be nice if college students voted for Republicans, but Republicans are we've made it this far without them and they're kind of annoying. So whatever, we'll just do what we want. And I think also college students can be more of a transient population. They're moving in and out. Maybe they're a student could be there on average 4 years. We can wait them out. They'll move eventually, they'll go to a permanent address where they can vote. It's a lot of apathy from politicians, from older folks, from advocacy groups who are we don't need to stand up for college students because those people are going to move. They're going to grow up. They're going to do X, Y, Z. We don't need them right now. We are doing fine without their support. So why risk our political capital to try to support and protect them?
Well, well put. And we at Democracy Docket do value student voters. We cover the challenges faced by young voters, not just student voters, but all young voters. And it is one of the things that I think if you visit the Democracy Docket website, you will see over and over again. The site gives voice to student organizations, to student leaders, to groups that are protecting student voters, and it also provides valuable resources that you can track for yourself all of the cases that have been brought by a variety of groups across a variety of states to try to tackle this problem of voter ID, of residency challenges, but particularly as they apply to student voters. So please take a second right now. Go ahead and click on the link above or in the show notes below and sign up for Democracy Docket. You can sign up as a free member and you'll get free daily and weekly newsletters. Or if you want more premium content, you can sign up for that as well. Thank you for joining us on this episode, and we'll see you next time.